If Ukraine strikes this one specific target, it is game over for Russia. I bet that you have heard something along those lines recently. It is sensible enough given that the southern end of the front line looks much better for Ukraine than it did only a few months ago. However, it is time that we sort out fact from fiction on today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline. Calling back to an older video, once upon a time, you discussed Ukraine's options for the Kerch Bridge. There have been a few attacks against the bridge since the war began, but we are currently in a bit of a holding pattern. Now that we are a couple of years wiser, debatably, and the situation on the ground looks almost nothing like it once did, how have the calculations changed for the fate of the Kerch Bridge? Very interesting question. Let me cover a couple of points of order before getting to the answer. First, the video referenced here is this one, 10 Reasons Why Ukraine Hasn't Destroyed the Crimean Bridge. I published it on September 14th, 2022, and, of course, within 4 weeks, Ukraine tried to destroy it. Impeccable timing from me as always. Second, I am currently working on a bigger project for the main channel about what Ukraine might be up to over in Crimea. This is more geared toward the medium-range strike campaign along the Azov coast, but obviously the bridge matters for that calculation. So, given that, I think for today it might be fun to look back at the 10 reasons I gave almost 4 years ago, and examine how much they have changed since then. I will then conclude with some brief commentary about how we should actually be thinking about the bridge. Reason number 1, difficulty. This has changed enormously over 4 years. Once upon a time, there was a question of how Ukraine could get some munitions all the way over to the Kerch Strait. And when the first attack on the bridge happened in October 2022, it was via explosives smuggled in on a truck. Fast forward to today, and we know exactly how Ukraine could attack it. Drones. Drones everywhere, both in the sky and the sea. Or perhaps use drones to mount mines and then detonate them, like this from January 3rd of last year. We also know that Russia's air defenses are in a pitiful state, so one imagines that if Ukraine were to ever make a concerted effort against the bridge, something would get through. So, at this point, it is really a question of how much damage Ukraine could inflict. Fully sinking the bridge would be very difficult because of just how much concrete goes into the major spans. That is why the bridge remains standing despite 3 attacks against it. One less obvious point here worth noting is that Ukraine has recently changed its targeting procedure for refinery strikes. Previously, it had aimed drones at fuel supply tanks, treating them both as a weak link and free-riding off their explosive potential. Now Ukraine has started to target specific parts of the refineries themselves. Evidently, Ukraine has made improvements to its drone designs to pack more punch, which has made those attacks feasible. Just something to be on the lookout for as it relates to the bridge. Reason number 2, the one-time cost dilemma. This is the idea that the costs of war and crisis bargaining are the costs yet to be paid, and any cost imposed before is merely a sunk cost. So, for example, I would not recommend that Ukraine wholesale destroy Russia's entire energy industry, assuming that is a possibility at all. Instead, shutting it down for the length of the war increases the Kremlin's opportunity cost for fighting, thus bestowing additional bargaining power on Kyiv. Applying this logic to the bridge, destroying it would be a huge economic cost to Russia. But if that is just the end, period, of the link between Crimea and the mainland, then this might not actually have the coercive effect that Ukraine seeks. Well, given the previous point, I do not think that this is much of a concern here. What Ukraine has succeeded in doing before is cutting off sections of the bridge, which impose costs on Russia for continuing the conflict, but also acts as an invitation to the Kremlin. If you stop, you can repair your bridge in peace. That provides the leverage that Ukraine seeks. Reason number 3, tit-for-tat. Back in 2022, we lived in a world where it was plausible that Russia was holding back on some of its ability to strike Kyiv. The bridge, therefore, remains standing because Russia might respond tit-for-tat to its destruction. Today, we are under no such illusions. Basically, the only thing that Russia is holding back is its nuclear arsenal, and that has more to do with how India and China feel about the situation than what is happening on the ground. What is stopping Russia from doing more is its own budget constraints and Ukraine's anti-drone defenses. No doubt that the Kremlin would order a surge in drones to respond to an attack on the bridge, but really that will just be borrowing from the next week's planned drone assaults. Fears of retaliation are not a constraining factor here. Reason number 4. Monitoring. Once upon a time, once more, Ukraine's Western allies had its intelligence organizations locked in on the bridge, observing everything coming across and informing Ukraine of what to expect. That is still happening. The difference is that Russia has basically stopped bringing significant military supplies over the bridge because of weight and chain reaction explosive potential. That may change if the logistics problem gets even worse heading along the Azov belt. But until then, intelligence gathering is not a point against striking the bridge. Reason number 5. Escape route. This explanation was specifically referencing an escape route for Russian soldiers, in the event that Ukraine began rushing troops onto the peninsula. Basically, it was a metaphorical golden bridge. Well, despite Ukraine's new mid-range strike campaign, taking Crimea is many, many steps away from even an optimist's war plans, so we can strike this one from the list of our current concerns. Reason number 6. Civilian casualties. Any operation to destroy the bridge comes with the risk of civilians getting hurt. Back in 2022, we were left to wonder whether Ukraine would want to accept such risk by destroying the bridge, especially as there was some doubt about how Western partners would feel about the situation. Returning to the present, we know that Ukraine is willing to accept the risks of civilian harm, because Ukraine has tried it in the past. We also know that Western leaders are relatively indifferent to the attacks, so we can scratch this as an explanation. Oh, in addition, this is one of the few things that you can credibly communicate in international relations. That is, Ukraine could ask Western leaders if they would approve of the attack and expect to receive honest answers. That is because if Western leaders would like that outcome, they need to push Ukraine in that direction, and Ukraine has reason to listen. If Western leaders would not like that outcome, they need to pull Ukraine away from that direction, and Ukraine still has reason to listen. Those are the exact conditions for credibly informative cheap talk to work, as opposed to the classic incentive to misrepresent when opponents issue threats to each other. Reason number 7. Population sorting. One thing that is definitely happening with the peninsula right now is that everyone there is miserable. If Ukraine one day wants to make Russia's hold over Crimea completely untenable, then it would like to have the Russians casually living there leave, and everyone who is either neutral or favorable to Ukraine to stay behind. The best way to do that is to make it easy for everyone to leave, because those without serious ties to the peninsula are more likely to take Ukraine up on that offer. Destroy the bridge, and suddenly you make it very difficult for anyone to leave, friend, neutral, or foe. Of all of these explanations, I think this is the most compelling argument that remains true today. Reason number 8. Maintaining moderate support. Those moderates who stay behind will still have connections to Russia after the fact. If Ukraine would like to keep them happy and have them be willing to rejoin Ukraine as an autonomous republic, one of the concessions they will look for is to have continued access to the Russian mainland. Again, the bridge is a key part of that. But as sensible as that argument is, Ukraine is too far away from making a military move on Crimea for that to be a notable part of the current calculus. Reason number 9. Ukraine wants it. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run, Ukraine will want to re-establish trade relations with Russia. In fact, in the case where Ukraine has retaken Crimea, the most likely explanation is that there have been major political changes in Moscow, and so Kyiv might actively want to work with whoever runs the Kremlin. Well, cooperation like that is much easier when you have a bridge flowing between the two to encourage commerce. Again, this story is logically fine, but Ukraine is still too far away for it to matter now. Reason number 10. Negotiated settlement. Think about Ukraine's internal preference ordering for a moment. It cares most about Kherson and Zaporizhia. Then it likes Luhansk and Donetsk. Crimea is its last priority. For the Kremlin, it is flipped. Crimea is the most important, then Luhansk and Donetsk, then Kherson and Zaporizhia. Imagine for a moment that things look militarily favorable to Ukraine, to the point that it anticipates securing a larger share of the territory than the current status quo. From a pure preference perspective, changes along the Kherson and Zaporizhia axis would make the most sense. But this presents a clear strategic problem for Russia. It would retain Crimea, but need to supply what would effectively be an island at that point. The Crimean Bridge is therefore a critical piece of infrastructure for that purpose, and indeed, it is why Russia built it in the first place. Consequently, destroying the bridge could force Russia's hand into fighting longer. I think that this mechanism has become more prominent since the original video. The home run scenario, where Ukraine recaptures every piece of territory, has faded away, but the more proximate threat to the land bridge has increased over this calendar year, and so maintaining the metal bridge to make Russia more pliable in negotiations is a reasonable perspective. So that is the update on the 10 mechanisms from 2022. And if I may offer a single takeaway line today, it is that the Crimean Bridge feels like the pro-Ukraine internet blob's white whale. How many times have you heard someone tell you, "I can feel it, Ukraine is just about to attack the bridge," or "Putin is done if the bridge falls," or "Ukraine just needs to sink the bridge to turn the tide of the war"? And let me be clear, I have no doubt that if the bridge were to ever come under heavy attack, it would be the major news focus for the week. It would raise all sorts of significant logistical challenges for anyone on the peninsula. It would be a huge political black eye for Putin. However, in terms of military relevance, the Crimean Bridge is past its prime. Rendering it useless will no longer cause a major military shift along the line of control. This will not be the game changer that it would seem to be. And just as a reality check for yourself, suppose any of those hyped up beliefs were true for a moment. And also think about the ridiculous scores of Ukrainian drones that venture over into Russia on a nightly basis. I do not know what Russia has for air defenses surrounding the bridge. Undoubtedly, there are a lot. But it defies belief that Russia has so many air defenses that a few days' worth of Ukrainian drones and missiles would be unable to penetrate the area. And still, Ukraine chooses not to attack the bridge. The only way to square that circle is that hitting the bridge would raise challenges for Russia, but the net consequences would not be nearly as substantial as this prevailing sentiment indicates. And that is why Ukraine has not struck it for a fourth time. Meanwhile, consider this your bridge to more great content. Yep, it is the archived playlist of the Geopolitics Helpline. Click here for more. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.